And the fact that all of them deem it unworthy, that shows the extent that which ideology is a motivating tool when it comes to historians rather than truth. And that, to me, is a big-time scandal. You move on, you look at the environmental movement, and certainly they have their fair share of intellectual morons. You look at someone like Paul Ehrlich, who in 1968 wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And in that book, Ehrlich said that in the 1970s, the world would undergo massive famines, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death. It never happened. There were these massive famines that he talked about, the predictions, he was wrong. And what did he do? Did he say, well, sorry guys, I was incorrect? No. He just sort of put off the day of reckoning even further. When that day didn't come, he put off the apocalypse to an even further date. He's sort of like a Chicken Little. Calling him a Chicken Little probably gives Chicken Little a bad name. And yet, Ehrlich is an esteemed professor at Stanford University. He is someone who has gone on to sell something like 3 million books. He was invited by the Today Show to take part in a 12-part series on global warming in the early 1990s. I found this a bit curious because in his book, The Population Bomb, he talks about the possibility of a coming ice age, and yet in the 1990s he's talking about global warming. I guess, the fads had kind of changed or something. He's a guy who's gotten millions of dollars in foundation bequests and prizes. He got, I think, $250,000 from the Heinz Foundation. That's a lot of ketchup. He is honored. The fact that he's wrong all the time is sort of irrelevant to these people. He is in favor of the right causes, and so he becomes a celebrity in the process. For the true believer, ideology is the Rosetta Stone of everything, meaning that ideology preordains one's reaction to issues, to ideas, to people, to events. It's not thinking. It's reflexive type thinking. That's just it's just reacting. And in the book, I examine dozens or almost a couple dozen of these intellectual morons. But I want to focus on one intellectual moron tonight and give a little bit of greater depth on one of them in the movement that he serves. And that person is Noam Chomsky. Has everyone heard of Noam Chomsky? He's a genius, according to someone. Well, Noam Chomsky, I guess for me, and maybe for some of you, I think he's probably best thought of as Michael Moore with his brain on steroids. He is someone who is a best-selling author. He's an MIT professor. And according to one survey, he is the most widely cited academic in journals in the humanities and in the social sciences. So he's a fairly important figure in academia. And this is a bit troubling to me that he is taken so seriously, partially because most of the citations that this survey looked at had nothing to do with his work in linguistics. They had everything to do with his political writings, which is not his field, and is a field where he has made a fool of himself time and time again. Let me give you 3 examples of what I'm talking about. In the late 1970s, Chomsky wrote a book review, and I brought that along too. He co-authored it with a guy named Edward Herman, and the book review was called Distortions at Fourth Hand, and the distortions that he was talking about was the idea that there was the killing fields going on in Cambodia, that there was mass killing, that there was a genocide going on. And Chomsky mocked this idea. He claimed that at most there may have been a few thousand people that were killed, but this was in areas outside of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge's influence, and so they really shouldn't be held accountable for that, but it's all a distortion. He even put the word slaughter in scare quotes. That's how despicable the review was. Now, if you were to ask me, Dan, I got a time machine. Where's the last place on earth you want to go? I'd probably say Cambodia in the late 1970s. It was really awful. You had probably more than 1 million people that were killed by the Khmer Rouge. Handicapped people were executed as malingerers and shirkers because they didn't put out the type of work that was demanded of them. The entire country was forced to don black uniforms, as if Cambodia constituted, a giant sports team. Anyone with glasses, for instance, you would have been killed because of the crime of intellectualism and vanity. This is the mentality that they had. They killed a lot of people. And at the time when it was going on, when it really mattered, Noam Chomsky was saying, this is all a hoax. This is not going on. We're talking about 1 million people that were getting killed. Chomsky had not gone to Cambodia. What did he base his assertions on? Well, he based his assertions on a desire to vindicate communism and an equal desire to discredit the West. It was an ideologically inspired rant that he had in The Nation magazine, and it had no basis in reality. And facts have shown him to be a complete crackpot on this issue and on many others. You move forward to the early 1990s. You look at, Chomsky wrote a pamphlet called What Uncle Sam Really Wants. And in that pamphlet, in the very opening pages, he says that ex-Nazis and U.S. State Department officials got together and conspired after World War II to remodel the world order in an image that they saw fit. Now, why America would sacrifice thousands and thousands of its own men to defeat the Nazis, only to reinstall them in power after the war, Chomsky leaves that unexplained. This alone should have been enough to, make him a laughingstock, but it didn't. He comes back, and it seems every few years his status grows, particularly amongst the left. He's like a guru-type figure. Right, you bring us up to our current age, and you look at right before the war in Afghanistan. Chomsky claimed that there would be millions of civilian casualties, millions of civilian deaths in Afghanistan if we were to invade that country in response to 9/11. He said in one instance that America was in the midst of apparently trying to murder 3 or 4 million people in Afghanistan. At other points, he said it was in the millions. The numbers are in. According to the Associated Press, the amount of civilian casualties as a result of the invasion of Afghanistan is in the high hundreds, 500, 600, 700. According to a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and this is the highest estimate that I've seen, the number of civilian casualties is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. We got any math majors in the audience? Got any people that did well in the SAT in math? Probably all of you. Well, anyhow, someone help me out. 3 to 4 million is greater than 3 to 4,000 by a factor of what? 1,000. That's kind of being off by a lot. If you were a stockbroker or an accountant, you'd be out the door. You'd be fired if you were wrong by those kind of margins. But with Chomsky, his status grows. I'm not a math whiz, but I figured it was something like 1,000. And that's really, really being wrong. There's a lot of error there. And yet, Noam Chomsky may be factually incorrect, but it's because he's politically correct. He is a superstar within academia, because that's what matters for a lot of these folks. Not the truth, but whether the cause that person is serving is the correct cause, is the politically correct cause. And certainly Chomsky is unmatched in selecting the politically correct cause when it comes to his peers. And I would argue that rather than any sort of desire for truth, is why he has the status that he has within higher education. When something is intellectually flattering, our immediate impulse, is not to question it. It's to accept it. And I think it's important to fight that. What has been said by intellectual morons, people like Chomsky and Rigoberta Menchú and a lot of these other folks, it massages the worldview of academics, of Western professors. It massages the worldview of scholars, and it oftentimes massages the worldview of students. So what they say is often taken at face value. It's accepted uncritically. And when inconvenient evidence emerges, like some of the evidence that I've put forward today, it's either overlooked, it's denied, or the person bringing the evidence forward is attacked. Now, before anyone starts to think I am an anti-intellectual person, I want to say that this is a pro-intellectual book. It is an anti-pseudo-intellectual book. And to drive that point home, I want to talk briefly about someone who I think is a true intellectual and someone who is a true man of science. And he's one of the most famous men in the world, Stephen Hawking. Everyone knows Stephen Hawking? Everyone knows him. He's a scientist. And Stephen Hawking, for many years, was famous for this theory that he had, that black holes destroyed the energy that they consumed, that there were things like alternative universes and all this Star Trek-type mumbo-jumbo that is a little bit beyond my comprehension. And he became famous for this. And I apologize to the professor if I'm doing him an injustice in characterizing his theory. But from my understanding, that's what he became famous for. And for a good almost 30 years, there was a running debate back and forth. And a lot of other scientists said, what you're saying is not true, here's why, and they had a debate. And this summer in Dublin, Hawking presented information in a paper at a conference with all of his peers announcing that, I've looked at some of the criticisms of my work, and I have to say, after 30 years, I agree with them. I'm no longer championing this theory. I think I was wrong after all. Some people were very angry with Hawking for doing this. To me, he's a hero for doing that. Because Stephen Hawking is not a partisan of Stephen Hawking. He is not stubbornly attached to some theory. He is someone with an open mind. And when his theory clashed with truth, he chose truth. When Noam Chomsky's theory clashes with truth, Chomsky chooses theory. And that's the difference between a true man of science and an intellectual moron. Someone who's going to side with the theory every time is the intellectual moron, and someone who takes truth is what a real intellectual should do. I mean, after all, if you look at the mottos of some of the great institutions of higher learning in this country, at Harvard, Veritas, the motto, truth. Yale, Lux et Veritas, light and truth. I mean, it's assumed that the professional obligation of a scholar is to find the truth. When you get lied to by a used car salesman or a military recruiter or a politician, you sort of come to expect these things. But when you have academics lying, people who are supposed to venerate truth, that to me is quite troubling, because things tend to fall apart after that. And why is it? Why is it that facts and logic and experience are seemingly impenetrable to the ideologue? I think there are two reasons for this, and I want to go into them a little bit. The first reason is that ideology, for many people, is a de facto faith. Ideology is the religion for people who view themselves as too smart for religion. And like a lot of other religions, they offer salvation, but the type of salvation they offer is a little bit different. They offer earthly salvation. And again, that's dangerous. And this gets us back to what we were talking about, the three intellectual morons that I started discussing at the outset. Margaret Sanger, who believed that a master race could be made through science, that men could be made perfect if you just took out the human weeds. You had Paul Ehrlich, who believed that he was saving the earth with his environmentalist crusade. Or DuBois, who believed that heaven on earth, an earthly Eden, could be made if only communism triumphed. These are people that were utopians. And that is really dangerous, because when you're providing earthly deliverance, all is permitted. The gulag, the concentration camp, beheadings. After all, ends that glorious will always justify means that vile. And unfortunately, utopian ideologies never succeed in their aims, and they never spare in their means. The road to heaven on earth invariably detours to a dead end that more closely resembles a much hotter place. And that's what happens when utopians get a hold of power. If you believe your cause will create heaven on earth, anything done in its name will be rationalized. If you grasp this basic concept, it's going to help you to better understand why people in the Middle East are chopping people's heads off. It's to create Allah's kingdom in the temporal world. Why in the past you had intellectuals excusing mass murder in places like Cambodia and Nazi Germany